As mentioned before, Ray Kassar ran Atari much as he did his textile factories, and his high-handed approach alienated many of his best workers, causing them to defect and create their own companies. After unsuccessfully trying to sue them into submission, Kassar flailed for a bit as he decided what to do next. Then one of his underlings, Manny Gerard, discovered a group of Atari employees playing, and thoroughly enjoying, Space Invaders, a non-Atari game. He approached Kassar and told him, "I'll tell you what I want, Ray. Take that fucking Space Invaders, send it up to Consumer Engineering, engineer it for the 2600, and license the name. And if you can license the name, steal the gameplay." In response, Kassar supposedly said, "Oh my god, why didn't I think of that?" It was a smart and intuitive move. Space Invaders was an immensely popular game, and Atari could have made a thinly veiled knockoff, the way so many other companies had with Pong. Yet Gerard, in the 2017 documentary Easy to Learn, Difficult to Master, The Fate of Atari, compared making a ripoff of Space Invaders to making a ripoff of Harry Potter. Sure, if a film studio makes a movie about young magic users in a boarding school, it'll probably do okay. But if you can license the name itself, well then you're really in the money. Atari approached Taito, asking if they would be interested in licensing the game. Taito had zero experience working with the 2600, and so accepted Atari's offer. In exchange for doing literally nothing, they would get around 50 cents for every copy of Space Invaders Atari sold. Fortunately for Kassar, one of his engineers, Richard Maurer, was such a fan of Space Invaders that he had begun programming a version of it for the 2600 in his spare time. The game was quickly released, and as expected, sold very well, shipping over 1 million units in 1980, and over 6 million in total. It was far from a perfect adaptation. It moved much slower than the arcade version, had simpler, jankier graphics, and much less smoothness to the animation. There was also a reduction in effects, with the player's ship producing no visible projectiles. Enemies would simply blow up if they were hit. All the same, it was a passable imitation, and players, for the most part, were satisfied. They could now play Space Invaders, or at least something very similar, at home. The simple fact that they didn't need to worry about lines or running out of quarters was a good enough selling point for most. Space Invaders, a licensed game, was by far the best-selling 2600 release up to that point. For Ray Kassar, the path forward was clear: make licensed games. And there were few licenses more valuable in 1982 than Pac-Man. Namco, like Taito, was perfectly happy to license their game to Atari. Kassar had little issue securing the rights. Adapting Pac-Man to the 2600, however, would prove to be a challenge. The Atari 2600 launched in 1977, and its internal processing chip had been developed in 1975. By 1982, it was showing its age. Competing systems like the Intellivision and ColecoVision had much better graphics. As far back as 1976, Nolan Bushnell considered the 2600, which hadn't even been fully developed by that point, to be an antiquated piece of hardware. After he left, Atari's engineering staff wanted to start work on a new system, but Kassar intended to milk the 2600 for everything it was worth. As Manny Gerard said, a good technology company must try to make its own products obsolete as quickly as possible. That being said, the fact that Atari engineers were obliged to work with rapidly aging technology forced them to get creative and make the 2600 do things it was never supposed to do. The 2600's primary designer, Joe DeCure, repeatedly expressed amazement at what Atari and Activision engineers managed to pull off. "I had no idea my system could do that," he said on more than one occasion. Still, the 2600 was old, and Pac-Man was cutting edge. Getting the game to run on the aging system seemed impossible, and in retrospect it kind of was. The man charged with adapting Pac-Man for the 2600 was Atari engineer Todd Fry, who received a bit of backlash from his coworkers for being given such an important task. Had they known what he would go through, they likely would not have complained. Fry was not provided with any schematics for how Pac-Man functioned. He had to learn everything about the game by playing it. He was given 6 months to complete his task, and was only able to do so by working 80 hours a week pretty much that entire time. He was, however, paid a royalty on every unit sold, a concession Kassar had made after realizing that continuing to lose talented engineers would eventually harm the company. The hardware inside Pac-Man's arcade cabinets was far beyond what was inside the 2600. It had around 32 times as much RAM and memory as Atari's system. This forced Fry to make massive cuts to the game's complexity. He simplified the mazes, cut down the color palette, reduced the variety and complexity of sound effects, and removed music entirely. The animations of both Pac-Man and the Ghosts was decidedly stiffer and more robotic. Many gamers complained that the Atari port had less personality than the arcade original. Yet the worst compromise came from the 2600's inability to render multiple moving objects at once. The arcade version of Pac-Man has 4 ghost enemies that are visible at all times, even when confined to the ghost house. For the 2600, the ghosts were only visible once they were in the maze, with the ghost house basically just being a blank spot in the middle of the screen. These ghosts did not have the strategic chase and scatter patterns of the original. They each moved in a randomized way, and there was essentially no difference between them besides their color. Furthermore, the system lacked the power to animate all 4 ghosts simultaneously. Indeed, the system could only show 2 movable sprites at once, and since one was always Pac-Man, this meant that all 4 ghosts had to split their movements between a single animation. The way Fry achieved this was kind of ingenious, but also kind of terrible. If there's more than one ghost on screen, each of the ghosts flickers very quickly in and out of existence, appearing for only a split second at a time until the other ghost appears for an equally short period. While the effect worked, the constant strobe effect led to eye strain for many players. Pac-Man released for the 2600 in March of 1982. By almost any measure, it was a bad game, and players were disappointed. But from a business perspective, that didn't seem to matter. Pac-Man became the best-selling game ever for the Atari 2600, surpassing Space Invaders by around 2 million units. Other ports of arcade classics, such as Donkey Kong, Frogger, and Defender, were top sellers as well, even though most of these were inferior to their arcade originals. Clearly, licensed games were a solid business investment. Even when they weren't good, they still made money. Seeing how well the strategy worked with arcade games, Kasara thought the same tactic might work with movies as well.